千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. Chapter 66, as you probably recall, is known as the Rivers and Oceans chapter. Rivers and oceans in this context have special meaning in that they receive water from all over the world. And the more they receive, the more they are like the great leader who is receiving tributes from everyone in the team. So here's what the chapter looks like. Relatively short, 14 lines. We were able to divide it up into sections for easier discussion. We identified a whole bunch of repeating characters shown in red, both in the ancient Chinese as well as the modern English. So based on the repeating characters, we're able to discern the hidden structure of this particular chapter, as we have done with all other chapters of the Tao Te Ching. So 4 sections, from the beginning to the end, we were able to get to the very last part of our discussion. In section 1, it begins with a term, the kings of 100 valleys. And this is in reference to rivers and oceans receiving waters from all over the place. So the 100 valleys contribute water to rivers. All the rivers of the world flow into the ocean. So you can think of the 100 valleys as the people. The rivers are the local nobles, the nobility ruling that particular piece of land. Then the nobles themselves pay tribute to the king. So that's the metaphor that is being used for this particular chapter. Then Lao Tzu talks about what is required in order for someone to lead. What is the ideal in the Tao of leadership? So there's a bunch of requirements that are covered in the second section and also the third section, leading to the conclusion in the last section there. So those requirements I have recapped here as well. Just very simply, using 3 slides, I can summarize and recap what we talked about before. So one immediate requirement to talk about is staying low. The Tao of leadership requires the virtue of staying low, which means being humble. Now, one important thing that we talked about last time is that being humble is not the opposite of being arrogant. Not quite. We often think of it that way, but the true meaning of being humble is the balance point between self-glorification and self-degradation. As you can see in this graph, visualize that spectrum, visualize the extremes. Then it's going to make a lot of sense that the path of moderation around the middle, that's where you want to be. And therefore, it is entirely possible for you to be humble and confident simply because you have no need to glorify yourself or degrade yourself. Not glorifying yourself means you're humble. Not degrading yourself means you're confident. You know, there's no need to flaunt. There's no need to grovel. No need to flaunt means you're humble. No need to grovel means you're confident. Therefore, when you look at it that way, it is clear confidence is not some kind of halfway point between humility and arrogance, like a little bit humble mixed with a little bit arrogant. There is no such thing. In the Tao, being humble and being confident is one and the same. How can they be the same? Let me explain. Think of a very common example that we have all seen in everyday life. When we see great leaders, the truly great leaders, one thing they're very good at is self-deprecating humor. So think about that. That is someone who is expressing humility, that is highlighting a part of themselves that is a shortcoming, that is funny, that exposes one of their vulnerabilities. And yet, self-deprecating humor is a sign of supreme confidence. So think about that for just a moment. It's a very good example of being humble and confident at the same time. So what we do not want is the extremes. And you can see here, the extremes are labeled. The monstrous ego, you definitely don't want that. Or crushed ego. Okay, well, that's also a bad extreme. So right around the middle, that's where we want to be. That's where we're humble, but also very confident, knowing what we can do, knowing what we can offer, but also knowing where we still need to improve. That's the best way to be. So that encapsulates the first virtue about a great leader, the leader of the Tao, in the Tao context that Lao Tzu explained. So what else? What else do we look for in a leader of the Tao? And before we go there, keep in mind that we all play leadership roles every now and then, whether it is in the family, in the home, or among friends, among acquaintances, associates, people in the community, at the workplace, among coworkers. Many opportunities to either play a leading role or, for the benefit of yourself, identify those who really get it. Identify those who are able to embody attributes in this Tao of leadership. So let's look at the other important attributes in that type of leadership. Non-contention. What is that? So in a similar way, oftentimes we think of non-contention as the opposite of being contentious. In a simple way of looking at things, we might think of being pacifistic. We might think of turning the other cheek. So I'm here to tell you that those are not quite the true meaning of being non-contentious. What is the true meaning of that? To be non-contentious means you are neither warmonger nor weakling. You won't pick a fight, but if you are attacked, you exercise your right to defend yourself. So as you can see in this graph, there is a balance point between provoking conflict and fearing conflict. So Lao Tzu says the world does not contend with the one who is non-contentious. And that is because your peaceful and harmonious nature, plus your readiness to protect yourself and your loved ones, together, that is the combination that ensures the world will not be contentious against you. So how do we know that this is what Lao Tzu actually meant? Well, in the chapter we're about to get into, chapter 67, there's actually a passage that will talk about exactly that. It will talk about how being compassionate is what leads one to be courageous. So more about that later. For now, just keep in mind of this path of moderation between the extremes. One end of the extreme is to be aggressively militant. How about the other end? Yup, the frightened coward. You don't want to be one extreme or the other extreme. You want to be right around the middle in that balanced way, the path of moderation, the path of the peaceful warrior. So leadership requires that. It is absolutely essential in the Tao of leadership. And to summarize everything, all the ideas from Lao Tzu about a leader of the Tao, I have this final graphic that we looked at last time. And let me say that when it comes to the concept of leadership, the Tao of leadership is not always intuitively obvious. That is, there are going to be times when you talk about the Tao of leadership that initially the concept seems puzzling, that it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Previously, we talked about where Lao Tzu spoke of the best of all leaders, the highest level. People don't even know that they have a ruler. So it's hard for us to imagine because we rarely see examples like that. But when it is explained properly, it makes perfect sense. And now that we have talked about being humble and being non-contentious, the primary imagery from this chapter also makes a lot of sense. It is talking about the flowing river into the oceans, and rivers and oceans are the kings of 100 valleys because all the little streams and the smaller rivers flow into the large rivers and then eventually to the ocean. So that is what this graphic is intended to depict. So I've got various elements in streams flowing into the river at the bottom. On the left-hand side of the graphic, that is where you see the Tao of humility come into play. To stay low, to speak humbly out of that Tao, it means to speak plainly. It means to speak in a way that is not aggressive or assertive or so positive, so absolutely sure of your own correctness. Being right is important, don't get me wrong. However, a lesson that I have learned in my life that I shared with everyone last time is that being right is not as important as following the Tao and helping people. So rather than to assert myself in a righteous way, instead, what I want to do is to provide the correct information when people want it. I want to do that instead of beating them over the head with it. And this is what I spoke of before. It is the reason why I used to be critical of others, but I no longer want to head down that path. I have hopefully evolved. I have changed, hopefully for the better. Now, in the middle, I have a section here about, I have a square that says support everyone. So the leader, the ideal leader of the Tao is not someone whose main purpose is to be at the front or be at the top, but instead the main purpose of that person is to support everybody. And if it is from below or from the back, that's perfectly fine. And maybe that's the best place to be to provide support. Now, people see this, people sense this. They want someone like that, someone who's supportive of everybody, to be the person who leads, because that is the person who can be trusted. And when that person is in charge, that person does not coerce everyone to do a particular thing, but instead, well, inspire, well, encourage, well, provide a vision and a direction that is compelling to everyone. And that way, everybody will gladly fall into line and go off in the same direction. And lastly, on the right side of the graphic, you're going to see minimize contention. You will also see maximize relationships. Those are connected. The peaceful and harmonious leader of the Tao is someone who will reduce the friction within the team, someone who can get people to work together in a spirit of harmony. That builds relationships. That is the service-based mentality in leadership, whereas the power-based concept of leadership, what we normally see in the world, that usually does the opposite in that it drives people away. It damages relationships. It causes contention, not harmony. So that's the last of the recap slides. I think it pretty much encapsulates everything that we talked about in previous meetings. And this means we are now ready to get into the last part of Tao Te Ching 66 discussion, and that is the paraphrase, and then after that, the full circle. So for the paraphrase of 66, we begin with the 4 sections that we identified. And then the first one, as I mentioned, is the one that talks about rivers and oceans, the primary metaphors, and how they represent leadership. So here's how I would like to paraphrase that section. Rivers and oceans are like rulers to valleys, just as subjects pay tributes to the king. The streams in all the valleys of the world flow into rivers and eventually to the ocean. This is the way it is because rivers are at a lower position and the ocean is the lowest of all. And that's the reason why Lao Tzu says, the higher you want to go, the lower, the more humble you must become. And remember, as we talked about with the graphic, to be humble does not mean debasing or degrading yourself. You can be humble and confident at the same time. Indeed, you must be confident and humble on the basis of self-knowledge. You know yourself clearly, your own strengths and weaknesses. So then let's proceed to the second section. The second section is about what the sages would do in order to lead, the requirements. Taking a cue from nature, the sages know that if they want to be in a higher position of authority, they must assume the lower position, like the rivers and the ocean. This means being humble in serving the people. Similarly, if they want to be in a leading position out in front of everyone, they must be willing to dedicate themselves to a supporting role in the background. So I think, again, in our world, we don't often see the idea of the Tao being embodied in different individuals. Once in a while we do, and that is because good leadership is rare. Now, let's go to the third section. This is about what we mentioned just a moment ago, being above or being in front, and what that means in the Tao context. So here's the paraphrase. This kind of leadership is always about service and never about power. Therefore, when a sage occupies a higher position, he or she can do so without becoming a burden to everyone below. When a sage takes a leading position, he or she can do so without creating problems for those who follow. People know the sage will not lead them down a harmful path. And that's what happens when you have a leader who is less than ideal, that there's the chance that this leader, out of poor judgment, will take everyone down the wrong path, a path that leads to harm. So we are now at the final section, section 4, the conclusion. Here's the paraphrase that I would like to offer to conclude the chapter. If you can be like the sage when called upon to lead, people will be more than glad to put you in charge. You will not contend against anyone, so no one will contend against you. Thus, your leadership will be harmonious. Ultimately, it will be to everyone's benefit. So this is, again, the emphasis in the Tao that it is always possible for us to create a win-win situation, no matter what we come across in life. So finally, we want to conclude with the usual full circle discussion for this chapter. So in the last line of Tao Te Ching 66, Lao Tzu talks about non-contention, a big topic, as you have seen for yourself. So if we were to link this line back to the beginning, what will we find and how do they connect? To the beginning, we see the reference to rivers and ocean, forming a full circle. The meaning is clear. In order to be the king of 100 valleys, one must be non-contentious. That's the beginning part. Don't go looking for a fight. Be the one to bring the peace. When you bring the peace, people naturally look to you for your next move. So just by being the person who brings the peace, that automatically puts you into a leadership role, the one leading the way to harmony. So think about water for a moment. Water in nature does not contend against anything. If there's an obstacle, water flows around. Water doesn't stop in its tracks and then cuts out the blockage, maybe a rock that's in the way. Water doesn't bother doing that. Water flows around. Flowing around the obstacles is a metaphor for finding a way around this rock of contention, a rock that represents an obstacle in the harmony of the group. The Tao cultivator finds a way to flow around it, bringing peace and harmony to everyone. The Tao leader is the one who brings peace and harmony. So finally, the key word out of this entire chapter, chapter 66, is the king of 100 valleys. And please feel free to change that to the queen of 100 valleys or the ruler of 100 valleys, whatever works. And keep in mind that you too is what this is addressing. This is saying that you can be the one to lead, to take charge, to take responsibility, at minimum for your life, if nothing else. This concludes our discussion of chapter 66 of the Tao Te Ching. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time. May the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.